We need to find a technician who can tell us where there's an outlet. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure. Are these microphones working properly? I don't hear it. Yes, the sound is going up. Very good. The volume's being adjusted. Perfect now. Now I can lower my voice. Good afternoon and welcome. Excellencies, lords and ladies, distinguished members of the House of Commons, honored guests, and good afternoon or good morning to those of you who are following this conference online from North America. I'm Andrew Whitley. I have the honor to be the chair of the Balfour Project, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this annual conference of the Balfour Project. This year's conference is special for two reasons. One, this is our first in-person event since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, and we're fortunate to be able to meet in this historic location. I know that there are hundreds of others who are watching online. Others will be able to catch up later if you wish on their favorite social media platforms. Being myself a rather advancing years and from an older generation, I personally prefer a hard copy record of an important event. So you'll be happy to hear that a full conference report will be available really quite soon. The more important reason why today is special is because this conference marks the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, or catastrophe for all Palestinians, those living in their historic homeland or else scattered around the world. My own mother-in-law, an elderly lady from the distinguished Ghalaini family, fled from Jaffa, where they had lived on the 1st of April, 1948, at the age of 12. Today, she spends her last remaining years far away in São Paulo, Brazil, still mourning her family's departure and the loss of their lands and home. And her daughter, my wife, is here with us today. The title of this event, Human Rights in Palestine, Responsibility and Accountability, merits a little reflection. Who is responsible for the gross breaches of Palestinians' individual and collective rights, rights which are enshrined in international law? And who will try to bring about some accountability? In legal language, who are the duty holders? As has often been said regarding Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine, the denial of the basic human rights of victims and the deliberate commission of gross abuses demands legal accountability. And if a country's domestic courts cannot or do not rise to the challenge, under the international rules-based order that Britain and the United States and others, of course, pledge to uphold, it is then an obligation on their part to seek redress in international legal fora. We'll hear about that, no doubt, more from Francesca Albanese. The Balfour Project has a special focus on Britain's historic and contemporary role in Palestine, where it was the mandate holder from 1923 to 1948, having issued the Balfour Declaration and occupied Palestine in 1917. This is not simply old history from dusty textbooks. Britain has a real ongoing responsibility for its abandonment of the Palestinians, for the barriers to their exercise of self-determination on their own territory, for the occupation since 1967 of Palestinian lands, and for the daily litany of undeserved deaths in the occupied territories. I call as my witness the spirit of Lian Madok, the little Palestinian girl killed in Gaza last week, and of Shireen Abu Akleh, killed a year ago in the Jenin refugee camp To add a personal touch, one of my own colleagues, a British official at UNRWA, Ian Hook, who I'd worked with in East Timor and in the West Bank, was killed in exactly the same place by an Israeli sniper exactly 20 years earlier, under eerily identical circumstances. As with Shireen, the Israeli response to Ian's death was denial, obfuscation, a refusal to accept responsibility or allow an independent inquiry. Years later, the Israeli authorities quietly paid compensation to the family. What a kind of accountability is that? Britain is proud to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It drafted or co-authored many of the resolutions passed by the Council since 1967, demanding an end to the occupation and the cessation of settlement building. Those resolutions have been completely ignored with impunity, making a mockery of international law. Far from conditioning future relations on compliance, our government has signed a long-term agreement with Israel that blatantly overlooks Palestine and the UK's legal obligations. These facts are what gives our country a special responsibility to tackle the human rights abuses being committed daily and to seek effective forms of redress. Sadly, British governments from both major parties, I should note, have consistently preferred to duck this thorny issue, hiding behind Uncle Sam in Washington. Over the next 4 hours or so, you will hear from a series of expert speakers. Their task is to give us an accurate description of the human rights situation on the ground today in specific areas. They will be followed after questions by a group of parliamentarians from all major parties who will speak on the role of Palestine and what is expected of our government at this critical moment. But this is not a talking shop. It's intended to be an action-orientated conference. Based on our speakers' suggestions and what we at the Balfour Project feel is essential, we shall draw up an action plan listing key priorities. This action plan will be for us and other like-minded organizations to adopt and champion. We do not work alone. Together, we will have greater impact. In my closing remarks, I shall attempt to summarize what we have heard this afternoon. What about your own role in these proceedings? You are all an active part of civil society, and you have a major part to play in informing public opinion and influencing government policy. You'll have an opportunity to make your voice heard and to raise your suggestions at 2 moments. After our opening speaker, Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, and our keynote speaker, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Francesca Albanese, I shall return to ask those of you in the hall if you have questions for Francesca. I regret that it's not possible to invite invitations from our online audience, but please feel free, all of you, to comment in the chat. Your comments and questions will be shared with the speakers afterwards. The second opportunity to pose questions comes after a short break scheduled for 4:30, and we'll try to stick to time. At 4:40, my fellow trustee, Dr. Phyllis Starkey, will pose questions to our 4 panelists, Francesca Albanese, Shawan Jabarin, Melanie Ward, and Suhad Bishara. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the Balfour Project's patron and opening speaker, Baroness Warsi. She's a senior Conservative politician, a former chair of the party, no less, someone who had the courage to resign from the government in 2014 over its weak-kneed response to the devastating attacks Israel launched against the Gaza Strip that year. Today, Sayeeda is co-chair of a welcome new body in the Conservative Party that supports Palestinian rights, and she tells me it's going from strength to strength in the few months it's been in existence. Strengthening support for the support of Palestinian rights among all major parties is one of our strategic goals for the coming 18 months in the run-up to the next general election. And finally, something that I've just heard from Sayeeda Warsi, which really took me by surprise, apart from the fact that she is a stand-up comedian, and I'm no doubt she will entertain you very well, is the fact that in 2007, I believe, she was voted in an online poll as the sexiest member of the House of Lords. Sayeeda.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that incredibly kind and warm welcome. And it's exactly why politicians like me come to these events, because we get our egos massaged as we are introduced. What Andrew failed to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, was that my husband stayed up all night 2007 to make sure I topped that poll as the sexiest member of the House of Lords. But in light of the fact that I was in my mid-30s and still had my own teeth, meant that I probably was in the running. But today, ladies and gentlemen, our conference is about rights, responsibility, and accountability. These are the themes for today, and I'd like to address each one. Responsibility. Who bears responsibility for what we witness? Today, Israel, as the occupying power, controls the lives of 5 million Palestinians. Historically, our country has much to answer for. The Balfour Declaration and all the broken promises. The conduct of the British Mandate, which prevented the development of democracy up to 1948, when we abandoned and ran. And today, the exceptionalism our government affords to the state of Israel as it flouts international laws. We helped to write, and UN resolutions we helped to draft. That responsibility brings with it today a duty now to make amends, to uphold international law and advance for Palestinians with their national and individual rights that they are currently denied. Rights. Whilst our official policy speaks of 2 peoples, both with the right to self-determination, including the option of statehood, only one has been able to exercise that right. Further, Israel, as the occupying power, not only denies the Palestinian that same right, but in its role as occupying power, fails utterly to protect and promote Palestinian individual rights, as it is obliged to do so. Indeed, it does exactly the opposite, with the Prime Minister of Israel unequivocally declaring that self-determination in the land between the Mediterranean and the River Jordan is a right exclusively reserved for the Jewish people. That is wrong, and we need to say it's wrong. And we need to work to enable the Palestinian people to determine their own future. Accountability, the second key word in the conference title. Here in Britain, we hold our government to account for its actions or willful inaction. And our government can hold other states to account if it has the political will to do so, sometimes exercising its political will in the form of armed conflict, Iraq, Afghanistan, and more recently, Libya. Sometimes by not getting involved themselves, but by arming them to defend themselves, as we have with the Ukrainians, and sometimes by isolating, as we have in Burma. With Israel, we simply lack the political will to make any material difference to the reality on the ground. And it has come to expect that rhetorical condemnation for its illegal settlement projects, settler violence for the blockade of Gaza, for evictions, for house demolitions, it's come to expect impunity from our country and from the international community. This is wrong. And it's why I called our approach morally indefensible in 2014, when I took the decision to resign from government and leave the cabinet. As a lawyer, I could not be part of a government that failed to implement its stated policy, its stated foreign policy values, and its stated commitment to the rule of law. As a politician, I preferred to walk away from the privilege of serving my country in a ministerial role, rather than justifying hypocrisy as a precursor to serving my country. A climate of fear is often the term that is used when people talk about the issue of Palestine. Advocating and actions for positive change are hard. Above all, they are incredibly difficult on the ground, where life is harsher and activism is a dangerous pastime, as we'll hear from so many of the courageous human rights defenders today. But in a much lesser way, it's also hard here in the UK, where the space for reasoned debate has been compressed and constructive critics of Israeli illegalities are smeared with accusations of racism. Our government is wrong in its attempt to suffocate dissent, to muzzle free speech, and to undermine arguments relating to ethical investments with Michael Gove's BDS bill, now I believe renamed the Foreign Affairs Economic Activity of Public Bodies bill. But civil society is pushing back. There is growing awareness of the injustices being perpetrated and the need to compel our government to act. That awareness needs to be given a voice. And I'm proud to be a patron of the Balfour Project charity, bringing us all together today. Proud of its awareness raising, of its education and advocacy work. And this project, of course, is not alone. It sits alongside charities like Medical Aid for Palestinians and IMET 2000 that do essential work on the ground. And now, of course, can I add, the newly formed Conservative Friends of Palestine, a much overdue parliamentary group at the heart of the Conservative Party, challenging the oft limited briefings within our political party and ensuring parliamentarians are at the very least informed and providing a platform to engage and learn beyond the narrow remit of CFI. The task for Conservative Friends of Palestine and all these other groups is to hold our government to account in the Commons and in the Lords. Let me give credit where credit is due. Over 35 parliamentarians have within the first 2 months joined. The first newsletter has gone out. There is a huge amount of interest. We've already engaged with the British Israeli community and the British Palestinian community. And the group has already had support offered from British Jews, British Muslims, British Christians, people of all faiths and none. And often we have to give credit to what the government has done. In 2019, the UK joined the West Bank Protection Consortium and has spent £5 million mitigating against threats to the safety of vulnerable Palestinian communities and to strengthen their inherent resilience. But it is just that, mitigation, when the task is peacefully and justly to end the occupation and all the suffering that that entails. But it's also important to call out and blame where blame is due. Last month, our government signed with Israel a 2030 roadmap for bilateral relations and trade. Reading it, you would be forgiven to think that the 1967 occupation, the blockade of Gaza, and 750,000 illegal settlers had simply never happened. The main reference to the plight of Palestinians, which says, I quote, "We will cooperate in improving Palestinian livelihoods and Palestinian economic development," is simply deeply patronizing and obviously fictional. So what do we ask of our government? Consistency. Consistency in upholding international law, the laws we wrote. Don't repeat the same old condemnations to no effect. Match words with deeds, as our government does elsewhere. Work with international partners, not as a shield behind which we can hide our inaction, but to lead. Don't be a drag anchor, or worse, head down the road of expediency, abandoning principles and universal values which we claim to be ours. Settlements are illegal. Trade or any other engagement with settlements must also be made illegal. Support peaceful recourse to the ICC and the ICJ. Insist on access to Palestine for the UN Human Rights Rapporteur with consequences if this is again denied. Defend human rights defenders. Recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination and recognize the state of Palestine now. Don't acquiesce in the status quo argue and take action for positive change in the long-term interests of Palestinians and Israelis alike. Positive change also means wholesale democratic renewal in Palestine itself, where we also have leverage and we should use it. Palestinians deserve a parliament which holds a new generation of leaders to account. So I want to end on hope. We need hope, and we need positive action to make that hope a reality. My hope here for the future is for British policy, which is both consistent and ethical, a policy based on rights. In the meantime, I ask our government simply to do no harm. I say with regret that our government's action and non-actions are harming the Palestinian people and damaging the universal values and principles which Britain should uphold. I want to end on a very personal note. We all come to these conferences, we hear speakers speak, we have some networking, we enjoy coffee, we make some contacts, sometimes we even make friends. But I try and come to these conferences and at the end of it, try and leave with at least one personal pledge. I'm often asked why I left government in 2014. There are all sorts of interesting theories about why I left in 2014. There's a fascinating one because I am Muslim by birth. There's a fascinating one that I left because suddenly as a Muslim, I could not take what was happening in Gaza. I can assure you all, my head hits that prayer mat no more and no less since my resignation. Some people say, well, was it because you were a human rights lawyer and you suddenly found yourself as Minister for Human Rights having to sign off some of the most appalling policy positions which you could not get behind? I say it's because I wasn't appalled at what Israel was doing to its own people. I wasn't appalled at what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, because countries do this to their people all over the world. I was appalled at my government's response to what Israel was doing. We have to hold our government to account. And I tried, ladies and gentlemen, to do that privately, publicly, personally, at formal meetings, at informal meetings, at cabinet, at the National Security Councils, over tea. But in the end, I realized that we had a policy, but no political will to actually see it through. And I therefore was not prepared to, one, be a fig leaf for a policy we simply were not implementing. And I was not prepared to put those hypocritical statements on record as Hansard at the dispatch box, because long after these amazing moments, and as the working class daughter of a mill worker from Yorkshire, I never anticipated that I would end up around the cabinet table. And however amazing that moment was, long after that moment had come and gone, I had to be able to live with myself. So I pledge today, as I have done since leaving cabinet, to continue to hold this government's feet to the fire and make it implement our own policy. Thank you.